this evening, we are going to spend 30 to 40 minutes talking about Munch's The Scream and the theme of fear and anxiety. I think this painting really is a kind of universal expression of both of these emotions. And it's particularly significant, really, this painting in this series, because it was quite a radical painting when it was painted in 1893, because it really shifted away from the idea of kind of academic realism that had dominated the 19th century. And for the first time, we're moving into a painting that is expressing a feeling through the distortion of the real world, and through color and line and form. So this is by no means meant to be an accurate representation, but rather a kind of very clean expression of a feeling. And that's summarized very well by Munch. I've written, there are some fantastic quotes by Munch, and I thought, by way of an introduction, he states, "I do not believe in the art which is not the compulsive result of man's urge to open his heart." So that sort of summarizes the series in a way. So thank you to Munch. Right, without further ado, we will have a look at the picture. As always, I will be sharing the image, which this week is a wonderfully high resolution image of the painting, and I will be sharing it for the duration of the session. And anyone, if you have comments throughout the session, please pop them in the chat and I'll do my best to answer them at the end. Firstly, I would be really interested if throughout the session, even if you didn't have any questions, rather than waiting for your responses right now at the beginning, if you felt like, having looked at the painting for a while, or maybe it's just an impulsive response, just to pop in the chat how this picture makes you feel. Because the overwhelming feeling that is intended to be expressed is this feeling of anguish, anxiety, and fear and panic. And I'd be interested to know if everyone gets a sense of those emotions from this painting. I have to say, for me, if I start by sharing, this picture has almost become, it's so reproduced and is so commercialized that I think it's sadly becomes, for me, slightly devoid of intensity. But that said, I think the more I've spent working on it for this evening's session, the sort of deeper and sort of more intimate I feel with, deeper I've become and more intimate I feel with the picture. And I think a large part of that is to do with learning about Munch's biography, which we will come to once we've looked at the formal qualities of the work. So this painting is about 90 centimeters high by 70 centimeters wide. It's painted in a combination of oils, potentially oils, but mainly tempera, so quick drying, medium, and pastels, crayons, colored crayons, and it's painted on cardboard, which was a huge surprise to me. So this is one of 4 versions of the Scream that Munch paints, and it's painted in 1893, thought to be the first version, but all 4 of them are on cardboard. Sorry, 2 of them are paintings and 2 of them are drawings. But they're all on cardboard, which is a very, as you can imagine, very fragile medium. It's really treated like paper, so anything on paper is quite unstable and has to be very protected from light due to fading, and of course normally the media that's used on paper might be something slightly flaky, like a pencil or charcoal, or in this case crayon. or pastel. So it's very fragile, and as a result, all of the screen paintings and drawings are incredibly fragile, and they don't move around very much. The medium of cardboard as well is, as I say, is prone to kind of the medium flaking from it due to its smooth surface, and Munch's particular paint type was also prone to darkening and flaking. So it's a very fragile work. This is in this version, the earliest version, is in the National Museum in Oslo, Munch being a Norwegian artist. And the second painted version is in the Munch Museum, which is also in Oslo. The Munch Museum also has a drawn version, in a colorful drawn version. It's drawn in pastel. And then the fourth version is in a private collection and was sold in 2012, so quite recently. Some of you may remember its astronomic value. It made almost 120 million US dollars at a sale in New York through Sotheby's. And it was sold to a collector, a man called Leon Black, who is quite a well-known private collector based in New York. And he is sort of public knowledge. He is known for really kind of buying the best works on paper, predominantly by artists from all periods. So he has the most astonishing collection, including Raphael's Head of an Apostle from the Transfiguration, which was the sort of record-breaking drawing that was sold by Raphael, I think, for about £30 million. So he is a very fortunate man and has one of these versions. However, today we're going to be looking at this one in Oslo. So what do we have here? We have some very strong lines, I think, is probably the first thing that jumps out. We have these very, very strong and powerful diagonal lines representing this, almost this sort of fence or barrier from the lower right corner to about 2/3 of the way up the cardboard on the left, the board support on the left. Other than those lines, there are kind of soft lines, yellow and red lines, or orangey yellow and red lines in the sky. And then below that, there are again round and soft lines in the fjord, in the water, in blue. And we see the light from the sky reflected in this pool of the water beneath it, and on which there are two rather abstracted sailing boats. So the painting is dominated by these kind of striations of colour. And then on the right, it moves into a kind of green round form, maybe the sort of defining some sort of townscape, or perhaps the bottom of a hill. The idea of green suggests vegetation. And then in the foreground, we have this extraordinary figure, if we can call it that. And towards the end of this sort of seemingly this pathway that the figure is standing on are two, again, much like the sailing boats, two rather abstracted figures. I think maybe one of them is wearing a hat, but very little attention has been placed on those. And our eye really is very much drawn to this figure holding its hands either side of its face. Interestingly, there is a bracelet I noticed around the hand of the right hand of the figure, and then we have this very unrepresentative or very unaccurately portrayed face, where we see two eyes, simply two holes for nostrils, and a very long sort of oblong shape for a mouth. If we get a little closer, we actually can see that there has been quite a lot of attention paid to the various shades and tones in creating a sort of three-dimensional shape, three-dimensional volume here in the head of the figure by using these lighter tones, this yellow, this pink, and then hollowing out the cheeks here. But by and large, I think we can all agree that this is a sort of ageless and sexless and amorphic, dehumanized figure who in its own right is kind of swirling and moving with the surrounding landscape. So from this figure, it almost feels, because of these soft contours, there are very few hard lines in this painting other than the perspective of this pathway that pulls our eye back towards the two figures at the back. We get this sense of sort of ripples or sound waves. So the idea that this is called the scream, isn't just an interpretation after the painting was created. That was actually the name that Munch gives the painting, although it's the earliest title for it was The Shriek Through Nature, or The Scream Through Nature. And that was actually it was in German, and then it's been shortened to just The Scream. In Norwegian, it is known as The Shriek. Interestingly, the translation is The Shriek. So the idea of sound is certainly something that was wanting to be conveyed in this picture. But we have these very strong primary colors. We have yellowy reds, we have blues, and we have greens, and then we have brown. It's very, the colors are very much compartmentalized. There isn't a huge amount of subtlety and certainly very little attention paid to depicting forms. So the idea of the state of mind of this figure at the front is intended to be represented through the rest of the painting, both in terms of line, color, and I mean, basically, we know what's being depicted in this painting, because Munch writes in his diary a very clear passage describing the feeling that inspired him to paint this. So while it's always been interpreted as a kind of a panic-stricken moment, as it were, it actually is certainly representative of that. And we know that because he writes it in his diary. And I'm going to read the extract to you. He writes, "One evening I was walking along a path. The city was on one side and the fjord below. I felt tired and ill. I stopped and looked out over the fjord. The sun was setting and the clouds turning blood red. I sensed a scream passing through nature. It seemed to me that I heard the scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds as actual blood. The color shrieked. This became the scream." So he then talks in another passage about being on a walk with two friends just above the city of Oslo, on this ridge called the Ekeberg, and he talks about having this, what I can only interpret as a panic attack, and this is really the result of that experience. He painted it as part of a what was known as the Frieze of Life, which was effectively eventually a document, a 22 series or a set of 22 paintings that documented the themes of love and death, and all of the nuances that sort of sat between, and he sort of presented it almost as if love arrives and then it peaks and then it dies off and then there's despair and death at the end, and he sort of sets it in almost a chronological sequence. And so there are a number of these paintings that, while they're individual works, they're also part of this series called the Frieze of Life. And when one of those paintings was sold, he would paint another one. So that would explain why there are multiple versions, not only of the screen, but also of other pictures in the series. And I think at this point, it's probably relevant to talk a little bit about Munch's kind of constant state of mind, at least until the last couple of decades of his life. He had a very very troubled upbringing. He was born in Adelsbrück, which was in Norway, and at 1 year old he moved to Oslo with his family. Then it was known as Christiania. He moves to Oslo, and he loses his mother to tuberculosis when he's just 5 years old. And then when he's 14, his sister dies of tuberculosis as well. So he loses two family members at a very young age. And he's left with, he has three other siblings, and his father and his aunt Karen moves in, and she sort of takes over the maternal role. But I think it seems that the father is a very overbearing figure, and while he was very much the sort of the patriarch and the leading figure in the family, and when he does eventually die in 1892, Edvard is completely distraught. He was sort of religious to obsession almost, so incredibly pious, and would say to them that that if they misbehaved, that their mother, who was dead, was looking down in shame on them from heaven, and a very kind of overbearing presence of guilt and piety. He, as I say, he actually dies in 1892, but he was very much present in Munch's upbringing, and was very much against the idea of this unholy profession, which was painting. Munch, he enrolled in a technical college and was sort of learning, almost like a sort of university. He was learning physics and maths and sciences. And he stepped out of that to join this kind of bohemian group in Oslo to start painting. And his father was very much against this. But aside from that, what he does do, Munch continues with his painting, and he sets up his own exhibition in 1889. And he displays a collection of work that he's been working on. And it was from this solo show that he wins a scholarship for a year to go to Paris. And he actually stays for a couple of years in Paris. So this is 1889 to 91. This is, he's in Paris, and he's coming across the works of post-impressionists at this point. Of course, Impressionism is still thriving, but 88 really is sort of Van Gogh's moment. So he's coming across works by artists like Van Gogh and also Paul Gauguin. And these were two artists that profoundly affected him. And in terms of their expression through color and gesture and line. And of course, this is painted a year after he returns from Paris. And he also continues working on his frieze of life during those years as well. His other brother, his only brother, married and died shortly after he married, and one of his other sisters was admitted when they were all quite little into a mental asylum. So, or she was diagnosed with mental health issues, and then later was admitted to a mental asylum. So there was certainly mental health troubles that ran in the family. And Munch was, he drank a lot, and he was plagued really all his life with mental illness. He writes, "Illness, insanity, and death were the black angels that kept watch over my cradle and accompanied me all my life." So his character was very dark, very tormented, and his painting was the kind of constant search or expression of these feelings. And I assume there was a kind of search for peace in putting these feelings down on canvas or on paper. And he believed that he inherited the seeds of madness from his father. So he doesn't put it necessarily on what happened to him with his family, but also on the nature and the character of his very overbearing and controlling father. He has an exhibition in '92 in Berlin. He's invited to Berlin by the Union of Artists, and it's in Berlin that he kind of starts igniting kind of controversy with his paintings, and all press is good press in a sense. So his exhibition opens, and it was closed by the Union of Artists, who invited him to exhibit after 1 week. But Munch saw this as quite a positive experience, and it certainly did kind of launch his career in the 1890s. So at this point, when he has exhibited in Berlin, he's really kind of on his way to fame and success. And in '94, he starts experimenting with graphic art. So he starts painting, he starts working with lithograph and woodcut and etching. And he had a very unique style of creating woodcuts, in that he actually used the wood grain as part of the illustration, as part of the image, and it was very distinctive. But he found that this was not only, of course, lucrative, as so often printmaking is, right, if you go right back to the sort of 15th century, but also it was he was able to sort of share and spread these feelings, and his expression went kind of further through print, of course, with the multiple versions. He had multiple sort of lovers throughout his life, one of whom was called Tula Larsen, and he had a sort of on-off relationship with her, which resulted in 1902 in him actually firing a gun that he kept in his house, and he injured his fingers, and that was the end of that relationship. But in 1908 to 9, he actually has a complete nervous breakdown, and he admits himself into a private clinic in Copenhagen with a very respected doctor, and he stays there for several months. And it seems to me, through reading various biographies, that he kind of, this is his almost his sort of watershed moment in terms of kind of letting go, at least partially, of some of the baggage from earlier on in his life. And he breaks into, when he comes out the other side, he breaks into a very different style of painting. In 1910, he moves into a sort of an estate, a farm on the outskirts of Oslo, and he paints the farmers. He paints nude portraits. He paints a lot of self-portraits, and he sort of enjoys really the last couple of decades of his life painting rather less intense works, and that's sort of all very well. However, of course, Munch's, as we all probably would agree, that the world sort of loves a tormented artist. Look at Van Gogh, for example, or Leonardo. And I think that the most sort of famous period, of course, of Munch's career is, of course, this moment when he's painting the Scream in the 1890s, and psychologically, he's suffering. I think the Scream is so powerful in that we do have this sort of timeless expression of a feeling, and I think it not only appeals or expressed something that Munch was feeling, but it's also a kind of universal state of the human psyche, and it can be appreciated, for want of a better word, at any point throughout history. I believe this is a personal expression of anguish. There are a lot of theories that this was painted just before the turn of the century, when we were entering, of course, a great period of unrest in Europe in the early 20th century, which did, of course, give way to movements like Expressionism, German Expressionism, that comes off the back of this painting. But I think that this was certainly a kind of catalyst for that. But I believe this really does come from a kind of personal place, rather than the idea of the painting kind of expressing a launch into a place of conflict and sort of industry and change, sort of more generally in society. I personally believe this is a personal expression, and I'd need to dig deeper in sort of documentation and letters or diary entries by Munch to kind of completely kind of consolidate that, but that's just my view. Let's get back to looking at the actual picture. I wanted to sort of shoehorn the bio in partway through, just so that you had a bit of context, because I think it is important with this picture. But interestingly, watched a short video by a conservator in the National Museum in Oslo, who was explaining that this is candle wax that has been and we've got some here as well, that has been splattered on the painting. There's no understanding why Munch decides to sort of cut the picture with this very strong boundary on the right. For me, it feels very oppressive. It adds to the mood of the picture, but it's not repeated in any of the other compositions, and clearly the composition sort of finishes here. So I'm not sure, I don't know if anyone's sure what the reason for that is. May it have been to fit into a frame, I don't know. The other versions are all roughly the same dimensions, and the composition is really very, very similar across all of them. Another thing to point out, and I'm really hoping that this image is good enough for us to see it. There is a brilliant. So under the paint here, you'll see that there's an inscription, which I assume is written in Norwegian. And it actually reads, I think it reads, perhaps this is painted by a madman. I've written it down somewhere. This is perhaps painted by a madman. And that was first noticed in 1904. So over 10 years after the painting was painted, it was on display in an exhibition and was noticed, and had been thought initially to have been added by someone sort of staking a claim on the, or sort of making a claim about the painting and its author. However, sort of infrared photography, which allows us to see particularly pencil lines beneath a paint surface, has confirmed that this was actually written by Munch himself. So he's included that little annotation in the painting. In 1994, some of you might remember that this picture was stolen from the museum and in February of 1994. So it was stolen on the day of the opening ceremony, or the opening day of the Winter Olympics at Lillehammer. And I think a couple of men managed to get into the museum and take the picture from the wall, and they left a note saying, "Your security is terrible," or "Thanks for the bad security," or something. However, it was recovered only a couple of months later. And then there was another theft related to the Scream image, and that was in 2004, so a little while later, and that was of one of the paintings from the Munch Museum. And that actually was taken in 2004 and was not recovered for a couple of years. And in that instance, the robbery took place in sort of broad daylight. There was an armed robbery, and they took the picture from the wall, and it was eventually recovered. And I think there were 4 men that were sentenced to several years in jail for the theft of the picture. I think the presence of these two figures, again, you know, almost sort of repeated in the two boats in the glowing water there, And this sky is supposedly it's a specific sky that you get in, as one would imagine, in the in Norway, sort of not dissimilar to the Northern Lights, I imagine, I'm not sure, but a kind of very, very vibrant red sky. So this may be something that was actually visible during this walk, and this specific type of sky. And again, there have been interpretations of bloodshed or lunacy, and as to why the sky went, he painted the sky this specific color. But I think it was probably an enhanced representation of what was actually there. But I think if we think about the actual feeling of the painting, it would feel very different if these two figures weren't there. He would be experiencing this anxiety, this fear, this claustrophobic moment completely alone and isolated, and it wouldn't be witnessed by anyone else. And now we all know that when emotions are witnessed, they are enhanced to a degree. Well, that's at least my view. And so I think by adding the presence of these two figures, you have a kind of, whether it's a judgmental onlooker or simply a bystander or passerby, there is the kind of added instability that this is happening in a normal environment, and this is happening in an environment within which you can be seen, and that but at the same time, it's a very sort of internal feeling, and it's a very panicky feeling that he's clearly experiencing in his own mind, and he sees it as a shriek through nature. So this is very much from his point of view that we see it reverberating through the landscape around him. Is it simply that by having these figures there, it's almost emphasizing, a little bit like the grief session that we did, by having onlookers, sometimes it actually, can sort of enhance the internal feeling, because the onlookers are seemingly not interested at all, rather than engaging with what's going on. And also, of course, a commentary on how people outside of the mind kind of deal with these situations that other people are going through. And I think that, again, that's very much left to us as observers as to what these figures are really there for. We don't even know which way they're facing. And as I said earlier, the sort of reflection of these two figures in the boats, and I think that also sort of identifies that space as the water. And of course, by having the three, at least marginally realistic elements, you get a sense of distance. So this idea of a world kind of fully encompassing you, or at least or consuming you, this recession of space with these distant hills or mountains and this sky, and then the small boats giving a sense of something in the distance, and then the figures that are giving a sense of the middle ground, and then the face of the protagonist obviously being right at the front, but not centrally placed. And I think that's another thing that's slightly perturbing, is the kind of offset situation of this figure. It's in no way does it feel kind of satisfying or content. Everything is thrown off. And of course, the image of this face, which is haunting to say the least, is one that we're familiar with, not only from the many versions, if one was even aware of these multiple versions. I mean, they're so similar that almost there's kind of confusion around the scream. Is it one thing? Is it multiple things? But because the idea of the scream has become so, as I say, commercialized or reproduced throughout history, in a sense, I believe it sort of desensitizes this image. which is haunting. It is a terrifying image. But when it's being used, okay, Andy Warhol, he makes a screen print, I think a screen print of the Scream, and then you sort of start looking beyond that and start thinking, okay, well, there's an emoji of the Scream, which I'm sure many of us use regularly, and also the cover image of Home Alone, Macaulay Culkin kind of grabbing his face, and also, of course, the mask, the Scream mask from the film Scream. So it's been sort of, it's kind of been taken hold of as this universal image to express this one emotion. But what is that emotion? Because for me, the emoji is, I think, the most obvious kind of place to go. What do we use that for? What are we trying to convey? Is it shock? Is it fear? Is it, it might be many of these things, but it's interesting to think about what this, in sort of in so few simple lines, what he's achieved here, and the kind of ambiguity, I suppose, that exists within this type, and how it's been kind of interpreted and reinterpreted, not only throughout art history, but also throughout history generally.